My name is ARDIS, and from as early as I can remember, I have understood what it feels like to be invisible in my own family. That evening, at my mother's memorial dinner, I thought the grief would make them pause, even for a second, to see me, not just the perfect, curated image of the family they wanted to display. I felt a sharp, almost cruel pressure in my chest, a stabbing tightness that made every breath a labor, a warning I could not ignore. "Dad, my chest hurts. I can't work. I can't breathe," I whispered, the words trembling, barely escaping my lips. My hope wasn't for sympathy or pity. I only wanted acknowledgement, a fleeting sign that I mattered. But his gaze cut through me, hard and unyielding, as if he could obliterate the truth with one command. "Shut up!" he barked, loud enough to turn heads, loud enough to slice through the gentle hum of the party. The words echoed in the golden-lit dining room, bouncing off the walls, lingering like a cold shadow that refused to leave. My chest tightened further, my heart racing not from exertion but from shock, disbelief, and the sting of being so completely disregarded. Around me, the room was alive with polite conversation, laughter, and the soft clinking of glasses, but it was as if I were underwater, separated by some invisible barrier. I could see Zania, my sister, walking past with a glass of wine in hand, her smile wide, polished, and intentionally oblivious to my struggle, her presence a polished mask that concealed a sharp cruelty. She laughed, and I immediately recognized that tone, the one she reserved for moments when she wanted to make me feel small, insignificant. It wasn't enough that she had always overshadowed me in our family. Now she found joy in transforming my pain into entertainment, recording the moment as if it were a performance she alone could critique. She added circus music to the video, exaggerating my collapse for effect, and posted it online, making my suffering a spectacle for strangers, friends, and acquaintances alike. But the horror of the night wasn't just the public humiliation. It was the realization that their erasure of me had been methodical, deliberate, and years in the making. Every word spoken, every choice made in that house, seemed designed to minimize my existence. My name left off invitations, my contributions overlooked, my very presence dismissed as optional. Standing there in the warm, overly scented air of baked ham, roasted garlic, and the faint tang of burnt butter, I felt a strange hollow sensation in my chest. Not entirely physical, but more like my very self was being compressed, reshaped, and ignored at the same time. The oven's heat pressed against my back, my shirt sticking uncomfortably to my skin, and each inhalation felt shallower than the last. I had been moving around the buffet, arranging trays, adjusting napkins, smoothing tablecloths, doing everything to maintain the illusion of control, of belonging. Yet the moment my body demanded relief, the reaction I received was derision, not concern. I did not cry. I wanted to, perhaps instinctively, but the tears refused to come, held back by the years of conditioning that taught me pain was something to endure silently. Instead, a quiet fury began to coil within me, low and steady, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. It was a rage sharpened by injustice, by the stark clarity that they had never, and would never, truly see me. The room smelled of celebration, of careful preparation, yet to me it reeked of betrayal. Every laugh, every compliment Zania received, felt like a jab, a reminder of the privileges she wielded effortlessly while I carried invisible burdens no one acknowledged. Guests moved past me, smiling, sipping wine, oblivious to the storm brewing inside. And I realized with terrifying clarity that this was not an isolated moment. It was a lifetime of being pushed to the margins, erased, ignored, minimized, made to feel as if my existence required constant justification. That night, in the midst of the chandeliers and the gentle hum of polite conversation, I felt the first seed of resolve take root. I would not disappear quietly. I would remember everything. I would witness everything. And one day the world, not just this house, would see the truth of me. I tried to steady myself, pretending that the stabbing ache in my chest was just fatigue, a fleeting discomfort I could ignore. I moved toward the buffet, each step heavy, deliberate, forcing myself to hold the tray of roast beef steady even as the heat from the oven pressed into my back, my palms slick with sweat from exertion and fear. The polished surfaces of the kitchen reflected a perfection that had never included me, and I felt an almost absurd irony that I had worked since dawn, chopping, stirring, arranging, vacuuming, scrubbing every corner of the house until it gleamed like a showroom, yet my labor remained invisible, attributed to some vague someone in the house. I didn't flinch, though. I kept my jaw tight, fingers gripping the platter as if my life depended on it. Behind me, the faint hum of conversation, the polite laughter of guests who didn't know me from a stranger, reminded me that I was both present and absent at the same time. Zinnia glided past again, laughing lightly at a compliment I couldn't hear fully, her glass catching the light, her every movement orchestrated to convey charm and effortless dominance. She was the family's favorite daughter, the one whose smiles were rewarded and whose whims were indulged, while my very existence seemed to be constantly questioned, corrected, minimized. The tightness in my chest sharpened again, the pressure now almost unbearable, as though it were being drawn tighter with every passing second. I tried to focus on the tray, on the task, but my hands trembled slightly, betraying the storm beneath the surface. I remembered 100 similar moments from my past, moments where I had been ignored, dismissed, or laughed at for expressing a need, a pain, or a desire. Each memory came back like a brush stroke, painting a long, painful picture of systematic erasure. And now, in front of 30 guests who expected me to perform gratitude and charm, I realized the full weight of it. They hadn't simply overlooked me, they had trained the world, quietly and effectively, to overlook me as well. I looked down at the buffet table, at the deviled eggs and trays of carefully prepared vegetables, the roast beef still teetering precariously on the edge of the platter. My hands shook, my knees weak, but I held firm. I could not afford to falter. Not here, not now, not ever. Then I glanced at the printed program for the evening, its gold lettering gleaming in the chandelier light. The words stabbed me like daggers. Host, Zinnia Marshall. Volunteer support, Ella, friend of the family. My blood ran cold. My name, my very identity, was relegated to a footnote, as if all those years, all my contributions, all the sacrifices I had silently made, meant nothing. Friend of the family, not daughter, not sister, not someone whose efforts deserved acknowledgement, just a friend, a placeholder in the story of my own life. I felt the world tilt, my vision narrowing as the tray threatened to slip. My breath hitched, catching sharply in my throat, and I realized I could no longer pretend. The physical pain and the emotional betrayal collided in a single, undeniable truth. They didn't see me, and they never had. I had spent decades proving myself, molding my existence to fit the contours of their expectations, swallowing every insult, every diminishment, every silent erasure. Yet here I was, collapsing under the weight of not just roast beef, but a lifetime of neglect. I leaned against the counter, fingers gripping its edge, trying to steady myself. The noise of the party faded into a distant echo as a different clarity emerged. If I did nothing, if I continued to endure in silence, I would be invisible forever. I swallowed, my throat raw, my chest aching not just from physical strain but from the realization that I had spent too long being unseen, unheard, unvalued. In that moment, a seed of resolve began to grow, sharp and potent. I would not simply survive this night, I would remember it. I would catalog it. I would ensure that every injustice, every dismissal, every slight would be preserved, witnessed, and eventually avenged. The rage simmered beneath my skin, a controlled fire sharpening my focus. I straightened, gripping the tray with deliberate care, and took a step forward, not just toward the buffet, but into the beginning of a reckoning that had been decades in the making. This was no longer about cooking, serving, or hiding in plain sight. This was about reclaiming my life, my narrative, and my voice. Every clink of glass, every polite laugh, every fake compliment aimed at Zinnia only fueled the storm inside me. I was done being the invisible daughter, the erased sister. That night, the first spark of my revenge, careful, calculated, and inevitable, ignited. The night pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket, heavy with the aroma of roasted meats and burnt garlic, with a soft hum of polite conversation and laughter bouncing around the room that had never truly belonged to me. Each movement I made, arranging the silverware, smoothing the tablecloths, ensuring every plate gleamed, was a calculated performance, a mask to hide the storm raging within. The pain in my chest was no longer just physical, it had intertwined with betrayal, simmering into a raw, burning clarity. I caught Zinnia mid-laugh again, effortlessly charming a guest who had barely glanced at me, her glass catching the chandelier's light, her smile sharp yet seemingly innocent. The sight of her, so polished and untouchable, fueled a focused anger deep in my gut, an anger honed over years of neglect, mockery, and erasure. Every ignored plea, every time my contributions were minimized, every slight that had gone unchecked surged back, forming a wave I could no longer contain. I remembered my mother's face, soft and warm, the one person whose gaze had always sought me out, even when the rest of the world refused. She had passed, and now the echoes of her absence were amplified by the indifference surrounding me. I felt my knees weaken, the tray of roast beef trembling in my hands, the sharp sting under my ribs almost unbearable. And then came the program, the cruel footnote of my identity, volunteer support, Ella, friend of the family. The betrayal was raw, an open wound that had been hidden in plain sight. My name, my life, my efforts, all reduced to a token label, a background detail in a story I had lived but was forbidden to claim. I felt a flicker of panic, a visceral fear that I might collapse entirely, but somewhere beneath that fear, determination ignited. I would not vanish quietly. I could feel a storm coiling in my chest, a controlled fury that demanded action, demanding that my voice, my story, and my existence be recognized. The tray of roast beef slipped slightly, and I gripped it tighter, feeling the heat and weight as a tangible anchor, a reminder that I still existed, still moved, still had agency, even in a house that had long tried to convince me otherwise. Guests moved past, oblivious, sipping wine, murmuring compliments, unaware that the person bending beneath expectation and exhaustion was the very one keeping the illusion of perfection intact. I caught a glimpse of Zinnia again, laughing at some carefully curated joke, and the rage inside me sharpened, transforming into focus. The years of silent endurance, of swallowed tears and hidden pain, were fueling an almost surgical precision in my mind. I needed to remember every detail, the exact words, the tone, the subtle smirks, the laughter that mocked my suffering. Every element of this night would become part of the evidence I would collect, the foundation for a reckoning that was long overdue. I glanced at the kitchen, the polished countertops, the trays of food I had prepared meticulously since early morning, and the stark contrast between my labor and the recognition it received cut deep. The ache in my ribs, once threatening to buckle me, became a steady reminder that I was alive, that I was present, and that I would not be silenced. I leaned against the counter, steadying my breath, feeling the cool surface beneath my palms, letting the faint hum of conversation and clinking glass fade into the background as I centered myself. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming control, about taking the first steps toward ensuring that the world, not just this room, acknowledged my existence and my worth. The humiliation, the erasure, the laughter at my expense, all of it had forged a resolve in me that was sharp, deliberate, and unstoppable. My mind raced, plotting each step, imagining the ways I could collect, preserve, and expose every injustice, every insult, every act of dismissal. The storm inside me was no longer chaos. It had a rhythm, a pulse, a plan. I would let the guests talk, let Zinnia smile and charm, but I would not be invisible. Every act of erasure, every dismissive glance, every smirk or laugh would be documented. And when the time came, they would see that their cruelty, their neglect, their years of silent erasure had not broken me. They had forged me into someone who could stand, witness, and demand recognition. That night, with the tray trembling in my hands and the warmth of the kitchen pressing around me, I understood something vital. I was no longer the child who bent under the weight of their indifference. I was ARDIS, and I would be seen, whether they liked it or not. I slipped back toward the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly from the combination of adrenaline, rage, and the persistent ache in my ribs. The house was alive with the soft buzz of conversation, the gentle clinking of silverware and glasses, laughter bouncing off the walls like harmless echoes, yet I knew better. None of it was harmless. Each laugh, each compliment aimed at Zania, every polite nod from guests was a reminder of my invisibility, of my erasure. I moved past the polished countertops and gleaming trays as if I were walking through a minefield, every step measured, silent, deliberate. I needed a plan, a record, a way to prove that the world I had inhabited, the life I had lived in constant service and quiet endurance, was real, and that they, my father, my sister, the family who had long ignored me, could not rewrite it any longer. My gaze fell on the smartphone sitting innocuously on the counter, its screen glowing softly like a quiet witness. The video Zania had posted, my humiliation captured and distorted into a joke, was both a dagger and an opportunity. I could replay it, watch every moment carefully, memorize every detail, every smirk, every laugh she had added. I could preserve it, use it as evidence, as proof that my experience, my pain, was undeniable. The thought steadied me, gave me focus, and for the first time that evening, I felt a sense of agency in the house that had long tried to make me feel powerless. I retrieved the phone, opened the video, and watched it carefully. 6 seconds of my collapse, a tiny moment, magnified into an absurd, cruel spectacle with circus music mocking the very fragility of my existence. I could feel my chest tighten, not just from the physical strain but from the raw, concentrated fury that coursed through me. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone. Instead, I pressed record on my own device, capturing the video, frame by frame, preserving the sound, the laughter, the visual evidence of their cruelty. Each second I recorded, each frame I saved, reinforced my resolve. I would not be invisible anymore. I would not allow them to erase me. I backed up the file, creating copies, labeling folders meticulously. Evidence, party, humiliation, betrayal. The physical act of organizing these files, of turning chaos into structure, felt almost sacred, as if each click and drag was a small act of rebellion, a reclamation of a narrative that had long been denied to me. My heart still raced, my breath came shallow and rapid, but I felt a strange clarity, a certainty that for the first time, I was directing the story, rather than being swept along in it. I paused and looked around the kitchen, my eyes scanning the polished counters, the carefully arranged trays, the remnants of a dinner meant to honor my mother. I thought of all the times I had been overlooked, all the contributions erased or ignored, every meal cooked, every floor scrubbed, every dish washed without acknowledgement. It was infuriating, and yet, in that moment, it became a tool, a weapon forged from years of silent endurance. I could feel the storm within me becoming a plan, deliberate and patient. Every insult, every snide remark, every time my name was omitted or minimized, would be cataloged, saved, documented. I would build a record so precise, so undeniable, that even their polished smiles and carefully curated charm could not erase the truth. I could hear Zania's laughter floating faintly from the living room, high-pitched and mocking, yet I did not flinch. Instead, I opened my laptop, created folders, labeled them clearly: tribute, party, evidence, Mom's voice. Each file I added became a small declaration of existence. Screenshots of the program that listed me as friend of the family, photos of the buffet I had prepared single-handedly, the text message from my old college friend alerting me to the Instagram story, even a digital copy of the tribute video with my mother's voice still intact. Every piece of evidence was a brick, and I was beginning to build a wall no one could tear down. I felt the ache in my ribs fade into a dull throb, a companion rather than an enemy. The physical pain reminded me that I had endured before and that I would endure again, but this time with purpose. The storm within me, once chaotic and untamed, had begun to take form, sharpened by injustice, honed by humiliation, and focused on one unyielding truth. I would not disappear quietly, and I would not let anyone deny the reality of my life ever again. The following days were a blur of quiet observation and meticulous planning. I became a ghost in the house I had always lived in, invisible in plain sight, watching, listening, memorizing. Every gesture, every word from Zania, my father, the guests who frequented our home, was logged in my mind like a secret ledger of betrayal. I had always endured, always observed silently, but now every slight was fuel. I noted how Zania's smile would falter slightly when she thought no one was looking, how my father's eyes would flicker with unease when the truth of my efforts, of my very existence, threatened to surface. I began to see patterns, the subtle ways in which they dismissed me, the exact tone they used when belittling, and the gestures that punctuated mockery. Each small observation became a brick in the foundation of my revenge, an arsenal of knowledge that no one suspected I was collecting. I spent hours on my laptop, compiling evidence, cross-referencing events, piecing together the narrative of a lifetime of erasure. Every photograph, every video clip, every message, every overlooked act of kindness or labor was cataloged meticulously, a digital monument to my resilience and their neglect. I labeled each file with care: Zania laugh, Dad ignore, public humiliation, Mom tribute. It wasn't merely documentation, it was a preparation for a reckoning, a narrative that they could no longer deny. I practiced my composure in front of the mirror, my reflection a silent witness to the transformation taking place within me. The girl who had once trembled at their scorn was gone. In her place stood someone sharper, calculated and unrelenting. My mind wandered to the moments I had been forced to endure, my chest tightening, the laughter of guests, Zania's smirk, my father's silence, and I realized that each memory, each pang of humiliation, would now serve a purpose. I imagined the way I would confront them, not with blind fury, but with a precision so surgical that they would understand every ounce of pain they had caused. The image of Zania's wide-eyed shock as I revealed the evidence, the slow recognition dawning on my father's face as he comprehended the depth of my endurance, became my private motivation. I spent evenings walking the room silently, imagining the placement of cameras, the angles of light, the moments that would most effectively capture truth. I knew I had to be subtle. Overt aggression would betray my plan, yet the quiet accumulation of control, of observation, was a power no one suspected. My hands, once shaky from humiliation, now moved with precision as I mapped out each step, each action, each calculated moment that would ensure they felt the weight of their actions. I could feel the anger inside me transforming, almost alchemically, into strategy, into patience, into an unyielding force. The ache in my ribs and chest, a constant reminder of my vulnerability, now felt like a companion, a metronome keeping the rhythm of my preparation steady. I began to create scenarios in my mind, imagining the conversation, the confrontation, the revelation, and each time, I played different roles, predicting their reactions, measuring my words, preparing my expressions, mastering the art of calm yet piercing delivery. The kitchen, once a place of servitude, became my war room. The polished countertops, the lingering scent of meals prepared for ungrateful eyes, were transformed in my mind into symbols of silent power, a testament to labor unrecognized but never wasted. I felt the weight of every suppressed tear, every swallowed word, every ignored effort, crystallize into a tangible force, a momentum that would carry me through the inevitable confrontation. I understood now that revenge was not merely about retaliation, it was about reclamation, reclaiming my voice, my presence, my name, and the recognition of a world that had long denied me. And with that clarity, I made a vow, silently, firmly, with the depth of my chest tightening not from pain but from determination. I would not stop until every shadow of neglect, every smirk of mockery, every silent dismissal was confronted, exposed, and made impossible to ignore. The night of reckoning arrived quietly, without warning, like a storm gathering behind a horizon that seemed deceptively calm. I had spent days rehearsing in my mind, plotting the exact sequence of events that would ensure my efforts did not go unnoticed. Every gesture, every word, every expression had been mapped meticulously. As I walked through the dimly lit hallways of our home, the familiar smell of polished wood mingled with the faint aroma of last night's dinner, and I felt a surge of energy, a mixture of anticipation, fear, and excitement that coiled within me like a living thing. My father sat in the living room, reading a newspaper, pretending oblivion, and Zania lounged on the sofa, scrolling endlessly through her phone, unaware that her world was about to tilt. I carried with me the device that held the trove of evidence, the culmination of weeks of patient observation and documentation. My fingers brushed against it, feeling the cold, sleek surface, and I realized the power it contained, proof of every slight, every insult, every dismissive action that had been piled upon me like stones for years. I entered the room silently, my presence unnoticed at first, as though I were a shadow moving with intent. Then I spoke, my voice low, steady, carrying an undercurrent of authority I had not used in years. "I think it's time we had a conversation." Both of them looked up, startled, confusion flickering across their faces. Zinnia's smirk faltered, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed recognition, the first hint that she sensed the shift in the balance of power. I set the device on the coffee table, its screen glowing faintly, illuminating the dim room. "This," I began, my voice soft yet cutting, "is everything. Every moment you've ignored me, belittled me, humiliated me, it's all here. Every laugh, every smirk, every act of dismissal." My father's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. Zinnia's fingers froze mid-scroll, her attention captured by the glowing evidence before her. I played the video, watching the moments of my collapse unfold again, but this time through the lens of empowerment rather than humiliation. I narrated, explaining each frame, each second, detailing the feelings, the pain, the vulnerability I had experienced, the fear that had gripped me. I described the shame that had settled in my chest, the isolation that had followed, the countless nights spent questioning my worth. As the evidence played, the room grew heavy with silence. Their polite facades crumbled, and the laughter that once seemed harmless now sounded hollow, echoing against the walls in stark contrast to the truth displayed before them. I watched as Zinnia's eyes widened, the smirk replaced by disbelief and unease. My father's hands clenched the newspaper, the veins in his neck taut, and I realized that the quiet strength I had cultivated, the patience, the meticulous planning, had achieved its first victory. Their world had shifted. They could no longer ignore me, dismiss me, or pretend the past had never happened. Every detail I had documented, every ounce of preparation, every hour spent cataloging humiliation, had become a weapon of undeniable truth. I described the nights of invisible labor, the unnoticed efforts to honor family traditions, the emotional weight I had carried silently while they thrived in ignorance. Each word, each gesture, each pause in my voice was carefully measured to pierce through the armor they had built around themselves. And in that quiet, charged space, I felt the first taste of triumph, not vindictive in nature, but deeply, undeniably satisfying. I realized that revenge was not merely about inflicting pain, it was about reclaiming agency, asserting presence, and forcing acknowledgement. The storm within me, once wild and untamed, now moved with purpose, deliberate and precise. I had become the narrator of my own story, and for the first time, they were the audience, powerless to deny the narrative unfolding before them. The room felt different after that night, charged, electric, as if the air itself had shifted to acknowledge the change in power. I could see it in their eyes, Zinnia's forced composure, the tremor in her hands when she tried to mask her unease, and my father's stoic mask, now cracking under the weight of realization. The next few days were a calculated dance, a careful orchestration of subtle dominance and psychological precision. I watched them like a hawk, noting how each glance, each hesitation, betrayed the silent acknowledgement of their fear. I began leveraging my newfound authority in ways that were both subtle and devastatingly effective. Simple acts, correcting a minor error in Zinnia's paperwork, offering insight that my father would have previously dismissed, were now met with startled recognition, a microcosm of the power shift that had begun. The once invisible girl had become the arbiter of control, the one who dictated the rhythm of the household without raising her voice, simply through presence and precision. But this was only the beginning. True revenge required escalation, a layering of consequence upon consequence that would make every prior insult resonate with clarity and inevitability. I started planting reminders of past humiliations in ways that would confront them continuously, subtle enough to seem accidental yet intentional enough to provoke reflection. An innocuous photo left on the dining table, a recorded voicemail played during a casual conversation, a carefully referenced incident during a family discussion, all designed to punctuate the pattern of disrespect they had woven around me for years. I watched as frustration gnawed at them, the thin veneer of normalcy cracking under the weight of accumulated recognition. Emotionally, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and melancholy. This was what I had desired, yet it came wrapped in the heavy responsibility of wielding truth as a weapon. At night, alone in my room, I reflected on every moment of suffering I had endured, the laughter at my expense, the whispered dismissals, the invisible labor, the public shame. I allowed myself to feel the full depth of those emotions, to let the anger simmer, to let the pain sharpen into clarity. And then, with deliberate calm, I transformed it into strategy. Each memory became a point of leverage, each emotional scar a reminder of the precision required. I began documenting new patterns, not just past humiliations but real-time behaviors, the way Zania reacted when confronted, the subtle shifts in my father's tone when my words cut too close to truth, the small, unconscious gestures that betrayed guilt or fear. It was an intricate game of observation and response, a mental chess match in which I held all the pieces. And as the days passed, I could feel the tension rising in the house, a silent storm brewing under polite smiles and carefully measured words. I observed every interaction, every nuance, every flicker of hesitation, building a mental map of vulnerability that would allow me to orchestrate the perfect crescendo of revenge. Then came the night I knew would change everything. I invited a few family friends over, under the pretense of a casual gathering, but it was meticulously planned. The lighting, the seating arrangement, even the background music, all chosen to create an atmosphere that would heighten attention, amplify perception, and ensure no misstep could be hidden. As conversations flowed, I guided them with subtle interjections, carefully chosen anecdotes, and pointed observations, weaving a narrative that hinted at past injustices without overt accusation. The effect was immediate. Zania shifted uncomfortably in her seat, my father's jaw tightened, and I could feel the power dynamic tilting visibly toward me. I had become not just a participant in the household, but its silent, undeniable force, the orchestrator of awareness, the subtle yet devastating presence that would finally ensure that every act of dismissal, every moment of ridicule, would be confronted, recognized, and remembered. This was more than revenge. It was reclamation, a carefully sculpted masterpiece of emotional precision, the kind that leaves no room for denial, no space to hide from truth. And in that charged room, watching them squirm under the invisible yet unrelenting pressure of accountability, I realized that the first true wave of justice had begun, and nothing could stop its momentum now. The morning after the gathering, the house was thick with unspoken tension, a heaviness that clung to the walls like dust, settling into every corner and crevice. I could feel it the moment I stepped out of my room, the quiet glances exchanged between Zania and father, the slight stiffening of shoulders when my presence was acknowledged, and the almost imperceptible hesitation in their steps. I knew that the ripples of the previous night's subtle exposures were spreading, and I savored the knowledge that the storm had begun to infiltrate their carefully curated facades. That day, I moved through the house like a shadow with purpose, observing, listening, and cataloging every reaction. Each gesture, each flicker of emotion on their faces, became a piece of the intricate puzzle I was assembling. Zania tried to mask her discomfort with forced laughter at a joke I intentionally made, a joke crafted to echo past humiliations she had orchestrated, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her unease. My father, ever the stoic figure, avoided my gaze, his usual commanding presence reduced to quiet rigidity. I smiled inwardly, knowing that my meticulous planning had begun to dismantle the walls they had built to protect themselves. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered enough subtle evidence to begin the next phase of my strategy, public exposure. It was essential that they not only recognize my reclamation of power but that it resonated externally, creating undeniable validation of the injustices they had inflicted upon me. I sent carefully curated messages to close family friends, subtly hinting at the truths they needed to witness, and orchestrated situations in which their own behavior would betray them to these observers. Every interaction was calculated, every word carefully chosen to elicit a response that would cement my position and amplify the consequences of their prior actions. That evening, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the curtains, painting the room in hues of fire and amber, I initiated the confrontation I had rehearsed for weeks. I called them to the living room, a casual tone masking the intensity of the plan unfolding. The device with all documented evidence glowed faintly on the table, a silent beacon of truth, while I stood with measured calm, feeling the anticipation ripple through me. I began to recount events with precision, narrating moments that had previously been dismissed, trivialized, or outright erased. I described each insult, each act of dismissal, with a blend of emotional authenticity and calculated control, ensuring that every detail resonated with undeniable clarity. Their reactions were immediate. Zinnia's lips pressed into a thin line, her usual smugness replaced by a flicker of apprehension, and my father's eyes darted nervously, betraying his internal struggle to maintain composure. I could see the realization dawning, slowly but inexorably, as the gravity of the evidence and narrative collided with their perception of themselves. The room seemed to constrict, the air thick with tension, silence punctuated only by the occasional rustle of fabric or the shallow intake of breath. I narrated not only the facts but the emotional landscape, the isolation, the shame, the quiet nights spent questioning my worth while they thrived in oblivious comfort. Every detail painted a vivid portrait of pain that could no longer be ignored or minimized. And as the final moments of my recounting settled over them, I observed the subtle yet profound shift in the dynamic. The balance had tipped irrevocably. The seed of recognition had been planted, and with it, the slow, inexorable growth of accountability. I had not shouted, I had not begged, I had not sought revenge through rash action. Instead, I had wielded the most precise and potent weapon of all, truth, articulated with measured emotion, undeniable and human. In that charged room, I realized that my journey was far from over, but the first decisive battle had been won. They could no longer pretend ignorance, could no longer dismiss my existence, my struggles, or my worth. And in that moment, a strange satisfaction coursed through me, tempered by the knowledge that the next steps required even greater care, precision, and emotional intelligence. The foundation of my ultimate revenge had been laid, strong and unyielding, and from it, the crescendo of justice and reclamation would rise, unstoppable, inevitable, and thoroughly deserved. The days following the confrontation were surreal, like living inside a slow-motion storm where every glance, every word, and every movement carried weight beyond measure. Zinnia's usual arrogance had dissipated, replaced by a brittle, anxious posture, as if the very air had turned hostile to her presence. She walked through the house with measured caution, her steps hesitant, eyes flickering nervously whenever I entered a room. I could see the subtle tremor in her hands when she tried to maintain composure, the slight quiver in her voice when speaking, and the way her carefully chosen words stumbled out, betraying the cracks in her polished facade. My father's silence, once a shield that protected him from scrutiny, had become a cage, imprisoning him in the awareness of his own failures. The subtle power shift that had begun weeks ago had matured into an undeniable reality, and I could feel the tension like a living entity pulsing through the walls and furniture, thickening the very air we breathed. That evening, I decided it was time to escalate, to bring the full force of the narrative to bear in a way that could no longer be ignored or mitigated. I invited a small circle of trusted friends, individuals who had witnessed parts of my struggle or knew of the injustices that had been inflicted, to the house under the guise of a casual gathering. The setting was meticulously arranged, lighting soft but focused, music subdued, and seating carefully orchestrated to maximize impact. Every detail was designed to ensure that Zinnia and my father could not escape the gravity of exposure. As the guests arrived, I maintained a calm, almost casual demeanor, letting the tension build quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Conversation flowed naturally, yet I subtly guided it, inserting carefully chosen anecdotes, referencing prior humiliations and subtle injustices that I had endured, ensuring each moment landed precisely where intended. Zinnia's attempts to interject were clumsy and awkward. Her usual quick wit faltered, her words lacking conviction or defense. My father's authoritative tone, once so commanding, now wavered under the unspoken scrutiny of the witnesses, and I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the silent recognition of the imbalance that had taken root. I narrated events not merely as facts but as lived experiences, painting vivid pictures of emotional pain, isolation, and betrayal that had previously been ignored or dismissed. I described the nights spent awake, the quiet tears shed in solitude, the sense of invisibility that had followed me through years of family gatherings and daily interactions. Each sentence was deliberate, designed to pierce through layers of denial, to make visible what had been invisible, undeniable in its emotional weight and truth. By the time I concluded, the atmosphere was almost tangible, a heavy mix of guilt, shame, and recognition that enveloped Zinnia and my father alike. Zinnia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her lips pressed into a trembling line as the realization of the consequences of her cruelty sank in. My father, stoic yet shaken, could no longer hide behind the pretense of neutrality. The depth of his negligence and the pain inflicted upon me were now exposed to those around us, and the weight was undeniable. In that charged room, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the magnitude of what had been achieved. Revenge, I realized, was not merely about retaliation. It was about reclamation, about asserting the truth, asserting one's presence, and ensuring that those who had caused harm could no longer pretend ignorance or evade responsibility. The first wave of fallout had begun, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as Zinnia struggled with the reality of her actions, the consequences rippling outward with each passing minute. This was the moment I had prepared for, the culmination of careful observation, meticulous planning, and emotional strategy, and I knew that from here, the path to full reclamation, justice, and undeniable recognition was inevitable. Every detail, every word, every calculated move had led to this charged moment of truth, a moment where the past's pain transformed into empowerment, where the powerless became the orchestrator of consequence, and where the long-awaited realization of my worth and presence unfolded with clarity, precision, and undeniable impact. By the time night fell, the house felt almost unrecognizable, as if the very walls had absorbed the tension, the confrontation, and the slow, relentless dismantling of pretenses. I moved deliberately, like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of reckoning, my every action calculated to magnify the impact of truth. My father sat in the study, a place once considered a sanctuary of authority, yet now it had transformed into a stage where the magnitude of his failures could no longer be concealed. I entered with measured steps, feeling the quiet power shift with every footfall, knowing that this moment was as much about reclaiming my dignity as it was about making him face the consequences of years of indifference and passive cruelty. His eyes flickered toward me, a mixture of wariness and silent acknowledgement, but he did not speak, allowing the weight of anticipation to hang in the air like an unspoken sentence. I began to recount incidents that had previously been buried beneath politeness and social facades. Every act of negligence, every dismissal, every subtle and overt way in which I had been minimized, erased, or humiliated. I described them not as accusations but as lived experiences, each one vivid with emotional detail, painting the landscape of my suffering with words that could not be ignored. The tension was palpable, like static in the air, and I could see the subtle physical reactions: tightened jaws, shallow breathing, slight shifts in posture that betray the internal reckoning unfolding behind his stoic facade. I reminded him of nights spent in quiet despair, of moments when I had silently begged for acknowledgement, for care, for the simplest validation of my existence, only to be met with silence or cold dismissal. Each description was deliberate, precise, and layered with emotion, ensuring that the reality of my experience was undeniable and unavoidable. Then I escalated, presenting evidence of the patterns of behavior, meticulously documented and organized, tracing years of neglect and cruelty with a clarity that allowed no room for evasion or rationalization. His eyes widened as he processed each point, the familiar detachment giving way to the recognition of undeniable truth. I watched closely, noting the subtle transformation, the rigid posture softening slightly, the hand trembling as it gripped the edge of the desk, the faint flicker of regret in his gaze. I did not need to shout, to argue, or to plead. The narrative, delivered with calculated emotional resonance, was enough to make him confront the reality of his actions. And yet, I allowed space for reflection, for him to internalize the weight of the consequences, understanding that true accountability requires acknowledgement rather than forced compliance. By the end of the evening, the power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the silent victim, no longer the one whose worth had been questioned or minimized. I had reclaimed my voice, my presence, and my dignity, using truth and emotional clarity as weapons far sharper than anger or vengeance alone. My father, once a figure of unchallenged authority, now faced the undeniable reality of his failures, a reckoning that could not be undone or ignored. In that quiet, charged study, I felt the culmination of years of preparation, the strategic patience that had allowed every moment to build toward this point. Revenge, I realized, was not merely about punishment. It was about reclamation, about asserting the undeniable reality of one's existence and demanding recognition in a way that was both human and unassailable. As I left the room, the weight of the moment lingering in the air, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation, knowing that the final stages of my journey were imminent and that the path ahead, though fraught with emotional complexity, was one I now navigated with absolute clarity, purpose, and unshakable resolve. The house, once a place of silent oppression and invisible suffering, now resonated with the undeniable hum of truth, consequence, and the quiet, potent force of well-earned justice. The morning light spilled across the polished floors of the house, yet the atmosphere was far from serene. It vibrated with the residual tension of the previous night, the kind that lingers after a storm has passed but leaves the landscape forever changed. Zinnia moved through the rooms with a hesitancy I had never seen before, each step betraying the internal collapse of her carefully constructed arrogance. Her reflection in the mirrors seemed foreign to her, a stark reminder of the persona she had cultivated and the consequences that now loomed over it. I watched quietly, observing the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the trembling of her hands, the shallow breaths that accompanied every small movement, and the faint quiver of lips that resisted tears yet failed to hide the mounting realization of the weight of her actions. The house, once her playground of superiority and manipulation, had transformed into a landscape of reckoning where every corner held the echoes of truth I had painstakingly woven into the fabric of our lives. I approached her with deliberate calm, allowing my presence to act as both shield and mirror, reflecting the consequences of cruelty, indifference, and entitlement. "Do you understand now?" I asked softly, my voice carrying the weight of lived experience, the quiet power of patience and strategy honed over years of suppression and humiliation. She froze, eyes wide, and the usual sharpness in her gaze was replaced with a vulnerability I had never witnessed, an acknowledgement that the tables had turned irreversibly. For the first time, Zinnia faced the mirror not as a reflection of herself, but as a witness to the consequences of her actions, her arrogance stripped bare, replaced by an undeniable comprehension of pain she had inflicted. The conversations of previous years, mocking laughter, veiled insults, public humiliation, played back like a relentless montage in her mind, each scene punctuated by the truth I had finally made unavoidable. My words, carefully chosen and emotionally resonant, reverberated in the air, crafting a narrative where every omission, every subtle cruelty, and every act of dismissal could no longer be hidden or denied. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but no words could bridge the chasm that had been created by years of calculated observation, patience, and emotional strategy. I continued, describing with vivid detail the nights of isolation, the moments of despair, the silent tears and unheard pleas that had defined my experience under her shadow. Each phrase was deliberate, painting not only the past but the present reality she could no longer ignore. Slowly, the weight of recognition settled upon her, a tangible force pressing against her chest, and I saw the first genuine tears escape, soft, hesitant, and yet profoundly revealing. These were not tears of manipulation or performance, but the raw acknowledgement of truth, the emotional reckoning that had been decades in the making. I allowed silence to stretch, letting the gravity of the moment solidify, ensuring that the realization was not fleeting but etched into memory. In that charged stillness, I felt a profound transformation within myself, a merging of justice, empowerment, and the quiet triumph of reclaiming my voice, my space, and my identity. Zinnia's posture, once rigid and untouchable, had softened, and the subtle tremors of accountability were visible in every gesture. This was the culmination of years of strategic patience, careful observation, and emotional mastery, the moment where the powerless had orchestrated undeniable change, where the subtle dance of manipulation and cruelty had been met with the precise and deliberate weight of truth. In that space, I recognized the quiet, unwavering strength that comes not from vengeance alone but from the reclamation of narrative, presence, and personal sovereignty. And as Zinnia's realization unfolded, a quiet satisfaction settled over me, tempered by the knowledge that true empowerment arises not from anger or retaliation alone but from the deliberate assertion of self, the careful orchestration of truth, and the undeniable recognition of one's own worth and resilience. This moment, heavy with emotional resonance and irreversible change, marked the final stage of a long journey, a journey from suppression to reclamation, from invisibility to undeniable presence, and from the silent endurance of cruelty to the orchestrated, human, and profoundly satisfying assertion of justice. The evening descended like a velvet curtain, wrapping the house in a quiet anticipation, the kind of stillness that precedes monumental change. I stood at the edge of the grand balcony, overlooking the city lights that flickered like distant stars, reflecting the turbulence that had consumed my world and now mirrored the serenity I had finally claimed. In the distance, the faint hum of life continued, oblivious to the storms of emotion, confrontation, and justice that had unfolded within these walls, yet I felt the resonance of my own journey in every shadow and beam of light. Tonight was the culmination of every sleepless night, every suppressed scream, every whispered plea for acknowledgement. Everything had led to this pivotal moment where the delicate threads of my past, woven with pain and resilience, converged into the undeniable clarity of triumph. My father, once a figure of intimidation and silent judgment, had been confronted with the undeniable evidence of his failures, his indifference, and the subtle yet relentless cruelty that had shaped my adolescence. His eyes, heavy with recognition and regret, mirrored the reality I had painstakingly orchestrated, and I knew that there was no retreat, no denial left possible. Zinnia, standing beside me, still processing the flood of realization and remorse, offered a silent nod, a gesture small yet profoundly validating, an acknowledgement that our roles had shifted irreversibly. I inhaled deeply, letting the cool night air fill my lungs, anchoring myself in the present, in the clarity of purpose that had guided me through years of calculated patience. The walls around me, once suffocating with the weight of neglect, humiliation, and invisibility, now echoed with a quiet, almost sacred resonance of justice and reclamation. Every memory of past indignities, every act of dismissal, every sneer or unacknowledged tear had been transmuted into a force far greater than anger alone. It was the power of self-assertion, of truth laid bare with precision, and of a voice that could no longer be ignored. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The nights spent in silent planning, the careful observation of patterns and weaknesses, the slow accumulation of evidence, and the deliberate orchestration of moments that would ensure accountability and revelation. Revenge, I understood now, was never merely about retaliation. It was about reclamation, about transforming pain into power, despair into strategy, and invisibility into undeniable presence. As I turned toward the grand hall where the remnants of confrontation still lingered, the subtle marks of disrupted composure, the faint tension in the air, I realized that the true victory lay not in punishment, but in witnessing transformation, in seeing acknowledgement replace arrogance, recognition replace indifference, and reflection replace denial. The night deepened, and with it, a sense of closure settled like a gentle tide, washing over every corner of the house and every memory that had once been tainted by neglect. I could feel the emotional weight of years lifting, replaced by the quiet strength that comes from having reclaimed one's narrative, one's dignity, and one's space. In the final moments, I allowed myself a rare glance inward, not at the victories over others, but at the resilience, patience, and unyielding determination that had carried me here. And as the city lights shimmered below, I understood that this night marked the end of an era of suppression and the beginning of one defined by clarity, empowerment, and the unassailable truth of my existence. Every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves, the faint echo of a forgotten laugh, seemed to celebrate the completion of a long, arduous journey. I closed my eyes briefly, savoring the quiet triumph and the profound sense of self-possession that had been earned through years of endurance, strategy, and emotional mastery. The house, the family, the city, all bore witness, consciously or not, to the culmination of what had been decades of struggle and planning, and I felt an unparalleled serenity knowing that the path of revenge had been navigated not with rashness, but with human intelligence, patience, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Tonight, I was not merely victorious over my oppressors, I was triumphant over every doubt, every fear, and every moment of silence that had once threatened to define me. As dawn crept slowly over the horizon, spilling golden light across the edges of the city, I stood at the threshold of a new life, the weight of the past finally dissolving into a quiet, resolute strength. The house, once a battlefield of silent manipulations, subtle humiliations, and unspoken resentments, now felt almost sacred in its stillness, a witness to transformation and closure rather than oppression. Zinnia sat across the room, her usual arrogance replaced by a fragile humility, the tremor of recognition in her eyes unmistakable. She no longer carried the pretense of superiority. Instead, there was a visible confrontation with reality, a reconciliation with the consequences of her cruelty that had left marks far deeper than she had ever imagined. I moved through the space deliberately, each step echoing the rhythm of reclamation, a dance of empowerment shaped by years of endurance, strategy, and patience. Every corner whispered memories of past injustices, yet these echoes no longer weighed me down. They fueled a serene confidence, the quiet triumph of knowing that I had turned pain into power, humiliation into authority, and invisibility into an undeniable presence. My father, a silent observer of all the transformations, finally met my gaze with a mixture of regret and awe, the unspoken acknowledgement in his eyes affirming the culmination of a long, arduous journey. I felt the enormity of years of suppression, misunderstanding, and indifference crystallize into a singular truth. My voice, my choices, and my identity could never again be overshadowed or dismissed. Every breath I drew carried the essence of resilience, the sweetness of vindication tempered by clarity, and the profound satisfaction that comes from having orchestrated justice not through rage, but through deliberate action and human intelligence. Zinnia, finally silent, seemed to absorb the enormity of what had transpired, her usual sharp retorts absent, replaced by a reflective stillness that spoke louder than any words could. I approached her not with vengeance in my heart, but with the serene power of one who has reclaimed agency, offering a gaze that combined both understanding and undeniable authority. In that moment, I understood fully that true revenge had never been about destruction alone. It had been about the transformation of power, the reclamation of dignity, and the ultimate assertion of self in a world that had long sought to diminish me. The city beyond the windows, bathed in early light, seemed to mirror my internal landscape, a mixture of calm, resilience, and unwavering confidence. I let myself smile, a soft, quiet expression of satisfaction and emotional closure that arose not from cruelty but from the precise, thoughtful execution of justice and self-assertion. Every small detail, the lingering scent of the evening, the faint hum of distant traffic, the subtle play of sunlight across polished surfaces, felt imbued with symbolic resonance, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another defined by freedom, empowerment, and the integrity of personal narrative. My mind replayed the long journey, from the depths of humiliation to the meticulous orchestration of every moment that led to this inevitable conclusion, and I felt a sense of peace that no words could fully capture. It was not just victory over others, but victory over fear, doubt, and every internal barrier that had once threatened to define me. As I looked around the house, at the tangible remnants of confrontation, realization, and transformation, I knew that the story of ARDIS had reached a point of irreversible power, a narrative shaped by patience, strategic intellect, emotional clarity, and the unyielding assertion of self. This was a moment of full closure, the end of long-standing cycles of cruelty, and the birth of a life guided by truth, confidence, and the certainty of one's own strength. With the city waking below and the golden light spilling fully into the room, I exhaled deeply, letting the emotional weight of the past fall away, replaced entirely by a serene, empowering joy, a joy born of justice claimed, resilience proven, and the undeniable realization that I had emerged not only victorious but profoundly transformed, whole and unbreakable.